recording. So hi everyone and welcome to our talk today. So our speaker is Professor John Finnigan, who is a CSIRO Fellow at CSIRO Environment and an Honorary Professor at ANU University. Without further ado, I will pass on to him. We are very excited to hear about your talk. John, thanks for joining us, and we are looking forward to hear about new developments in micrometeorology.
Thank you, Azada. Good morning, everyone. Well, it's good afternoon, actually. It was good morning when I wrote those notes. Thanks for coming to the talk. And just note my co-authors who've contributed to the story I want to tell today. If I can get this thing to do. Here we go. So what I want to talk about is the way we modify the standard theories of atmospheric turbulence in the surface layer when we have a tall plant canopy. So fundamental theories had been developed in Russia in the 1940s and 50s by Kolmogorov, Monin, Abukov, and later by Akiva Yaglom and others. And these theories link the turbulent fluxes to the mean gradients of momentum and scalars near the surface. And before the days of direct measurement of eddy fluxes with sonic anemometers, these were basically the basis of how we interpreted and measured fluxes of biologically important scalars. But they hadn't really been tested until the 1960s. And that happened in a series of experiments by people at CSIRO at Kerrang in Victoria and Hay in New South Wales. And then famously the Kansas experiment in the USA in 1968, where for the first time sonic anemometers developed by Chandra and Kaimal and gradients of mean concentrations could be measured simultaneously. And that provided the actual empirical basis for Monin-Nabokov similarity theory, on MOST as we usually call it. And 70 years on, Monin-Nabokov theory still forms the basis of model parameterizations in weather and climate models. And we also found out that quite early on that Monin-Nabokov theory seemed to break down near the top of tall plant canopies like forests. Well, about 30% of the Earth's surface is covered with forests. And so we did need to understand why these MOS formulations broke down and how to fix them. And in the modern, today's sort of context of interest in climate change and the carbon cycle, forest canopies are also the largest standing biomass carbon stores on Earth. So accurately monitoring carbon and energy exchange between forests and the atmosphere is critically important. And the FluxNet program, which probably has spent about $1 billion plus, one of the biggest geophysical experiments we've ever mounted, depends on understanding the details of this turbulence exchange in order to interpret the measurements that you get from eddy flux towers. So let's have a look first at the structure of the daytime atmospheric boundary layer. So boundary layer meteorologists conventionally divide the atmospheric boundary layer into a series of layers where different physical processes dominate. So in the mixed layer, in the middle of between the surface layer and the top of the boundary layer, the total depth of the boundary layer, Zi, determines the turbulent structure of the floor. But in the surface layer, the presence of the ground is felt by the turbulence. And so that's a key parameter determining the structure. Zi is between 1 and 3 kilometers in mid-latitudes in the afternoon. So our interest in problems like biosphere-atmosphere exchange focus initially on the surface layer, but we'll see in this talk, I hope, that to understand what's happening there, we need to understand what's happening all the way through the boundary layer. So looking in more detail at the surface layer, we nowadays divide it into 3 regions. The canopy layer, where the air flows around trees or plants and sometimes around cities, if you're looking at urban canopies. The roughness sublayer, which extends up to 2 or 3 canopy heights, where the turbulent structure is affected by processes in the canopy, even though we're above the vegetation. And then the inertial sublayer, sometimes called the log layer, where the Monin-Nabokov theory actually works until we get up into the mixed layer. So the formula at the bottom of this slide express the key scales that determine how turbulence in the surface layer above the canopy behaves. So Z, the height above the ground, is important. The kinematic momentum flux, UW, usually we use U star, the friction velocity, the square root of minus UW, as a measure of this. Theta star, the normalized, sorry, the temperature scale, which is the kinematic heat flux divided by U star, and this parameter L, the Oberkopf length, which expresses the relative importance of shear and buoyancy in generating turbulence. So again, this is one of the key advances that came out of the Monin-Oberkopf group. And the way we use these scales is simply to apply similarity theory or dimensional analysis, the Buckingham Pi theorem. Given we've got these several parameters, four parameters really, governing the dependent variables. And we have three dimensions: length, time, and let's see one. Oh, can't even read my own thing now. I'm trying to read what I've got here. Yeah, so we have three dimensions: length, time, and temperature. And from that, we can form two independent dimensionless groups. And it's conventional to say one of these is the dependent variable of interest, made dimensionless with one of the other parameters, and take the other as this dimensionless group, the height divided by the Oberkopf length. And so this parameter Z upon L appears ubiquitously in Monin-Oberkopf similarity theory. So we can make the mean velocity gradient and the temperature gradient dimensionless with these scales. So du by dz multiplied by u star upon kz is a function only of this dimensionless parameter phi of z upon L. And the same with the temperature gradient. Theta star on kz is a function only of phi h of z upon L. Move it on. So these dimensionless phi functions link the fluxes in the mean gradients, as I said. So if we look, for example, at the kinematic momentum flux, the friction on the ground divided by the density, or u star squared, we can group the terms as a diffusivity, u star kz, and 1 upon phi m, or the inverse of phi m, which is functions of stability. So when there's no stability, when things are neutrally stratified, this function is 1, and so the diffusivity is just u star and kz. If things get unstably stratified, so z upon L becomes negative, that phi becomes smaller than 1, and so phi m to minus 1 goes bigger, and the diffusivity increases. So the extra mixing caused by buoyancy increases the rate at which momentum is transferred down the velocity gradient. And on the stable side, the other things go in the other direction. Phi becomes larger than 1, so the diffusivity becomes smaller, and stability quenches the mixing power of the turbulence. Same thing happens for the heat flux. Now we're using this different function, phi h to minus 1. These two are slightly different. And again, there's a reminder of what Z upon L is actually means. The Kansas and those earlier Wangara experiments tried to determine the empirical function, the empirical form of these functions, and then the parameters that entered into them, alpha 1 and alpha 2. And it's in a sense, it's been a cottage industry for many years to actually refine these values more and more. And initially, this was all done by experiment empirically, but quite recently, Gabby Catola and a series of colleagues, Dan Lee and Eli Bouzid and others, have actually linked or derived these values directly now from basic theory. So how does Monadnock theory work in practice? I'm going to show you some measurements from our Ausflux site. Ausflux is the Australian arm of the FluxNet. This was a 40-meter alpine ash forest in western New South Wales, southwestern New South Wales, 40-meter tower, and we had measurements up the tower as well. And if we look at the gradients, sorry, the variation of velocity with height, velocity made dimensionless with U star. First of all, when Z upon L, where Z in this case is HC, the canopy height, was near zero, so nearly neutral. The solid line, black line, is what Monadnock theory would predict unmodified. And we find that it departs from the measured values quite a lot as we approach the canopy. If we go to more unstable conditions, the departures are even more severe. And as we get to quite unstable conditions, there's a very big gap between what unmodified Monadnock predicts and what this modified theory predicts. I'll come back to what the modified theory involves later in the talk. But this has been known since the 1970s. This is data from a paper by my old colleagues Michael Raupak and Alistair Tom, sadly both no longer with us. But for the 5 functions for heat, the actual observed 5 functions which would make the theory work, the sort of differences that you would have to add to the phi's to make them match observations. The phi's have to be, or phi h to minus 1, which is related to the diffusivity, has to be much higher than we actually would predict from those classic dimensionless forms that were found at Kansas. The same with momentum, slightly higher. Water vapor, similar to heat. So it was known way back in the 70s that somehow or other, the turbulence near the top of the plant canopy was actually better at mixing than the turbulence higher in the inertial sublayer or the log layer, which did obey Monadnock theory. So it was a kind of a guiding question for micrometeorology for probably the next 40 years to figure out what was the origin of this extra mixing. It turned out to be large coherent eddies around the top of the canopy. Where did these come from? And once you figured that out, how could you use them in theories to modify Monadnock theory? So what I'm going to talk about today is, first of all, how we now understand that, and quite recently understand that. And start by looking at the whole boundary layer and the structure of the large eddies that span the entire atmospheric boundary layer. Then drop down to the surface layer, or the bottom of the surface layer, and talk about these coherent mixing layer eddies that dominate the canopy roughness sublayer when shear is high and instability low. And that's been known since the 90s. And then, which is much more recent, the structure of the canopy plume eddies that dominate the canopy roughness sublayer when shear is low and instability high. And then again, which is sort of very new understanding, which has only come up in the last maybe 5 years, maybe a bit longer, the direct coupling between these 3 eddy types, the ones that span the entire ABL and the ones that occur in the canopy roughness sublayer. And then finally, we'll look at the implications for modeling and tower measurements. Seem to have trouble moving this one. Here we go. So these animations are taken from a very large-scale, large eddy simulation by Ned Passon from NCAR. And what we're seeing here is the force structure made visible by looking at the temperature field. And one is this large eddy simulation has a 20-meter resolved forest canopy at the bottom, and it goes up to about 1,100 meters. So we see the entire mixed layer at the top of the boundary layer, the top of the surface layer. It's high resolution. It resolves the turbulent eddies within the canopy and all the way through the boundary layer. And it goes through a series of stability domains when the horizontal domain that's being modeled is 5 kilometers by 5 kilometers, as I said, about 1.5 kilometers deep. And the way the stability of the whole domain was changed was by varying the geostrophic wind, but keeping the solar insolation similar to about 2 p.m. on a Colorado summer afternoon. And we can see that in the near neutral case, there's a clearly strongly sheared structures moving through the surface layer. And if you look closely down at the surface, we can see these sort of repeating eddy structures confined to near the canopy. Whereas in the free convection case, where there's no geostrophic wind, we get convective plumes that penetrate the canopy. But in between the convective plumes, we get similar small-scale eddy structures moving through the canopy. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. If we step through the results of this large eddy simulation for different stabilities, as I said, arrived at by changing the geostrophic wind. And here we're looking at the vertical velocity at 200 meters above the ground. And we see the white areas, the light areas are rising air, and the dark areas descending air. So what we're seeing at these near neutral cases is a pattern of streamwise rolls. These are ubiquitous in the atmosphere, and where they rise, you get condensation. We often see cloud bands, and they span the entire boundary layer. So these are rolls about can't see now. Those are about 50 or 60 canopy heights in horizontal extent. As we move to slightly more unstable, the rolls start to become a bit more ragged. And then as we move to more, significantly unstable, they start to tend towards closed convection cells. And finally, at the free convection case, we get in rarely Bernard convection cells, which again span the entire boundary layer depth, but have sort of coherent rising walls, and in between larger scale descending areas. So these atmospheric boundary layer scale eddies, they modulate the shear and the stability at the top of the canopy and in the roughness sublayer. So we can look at this weakly unstable case where we have descending areas of faster moving air coming down between the rolls, and especially average Reynolds stress at the canopy top, the blue colors here, are really, that's where you find them, where the descending parts of those rolls, between the rolls, bring fast moving air down to the surface, and naturally we get larger values of the Reynolds stress. In the strongly unstable cells, we find this strong shear, strong Reynolds stress regions on the downwind side of the cells, where the descending air is added, where the shear caused by the circulating in the cells themselves augments any net movement of the net drift, if you like, or net boundary layer velocity. So you find the strong shear regions at the downwind side of these cells. And if you look at the heat flux as well, we find that in the weakly unstable strong shear regions, especially average Reynolds stress and the heat flux more or less coincide. But in the strongly unstable regions, the strong heat flux is in the regions of rising air, whereas again, the strong Reynolds stress is in the regions of descending air and strong shear. So we have a good idea now of how these very large scale motions modulate what's happening near the top of the canopy. But to understand what's happening near the top of the canopy, we need more detailed measurements through the canopy itself. Now, we want to get a good idea of the turbulent structure. So we're really looking for detailed measurements with sonic anemometers, the weapon of choice for measuring canopy turbulence. But there haven't been many experiments where we've had so many sonic anemometers to deploy. This is the canopy horizontal array turbulence study conducted by Ned Patton in a walnut orchard in the Central Valley of California, 2011. And the original intent of this was to actually see whether the parameterizations in large eddy simulations actually match what was measured directly in the canopy. But in fact, it's also turned out to be a tremendous source of information for canopy turbulence in general. But before that, although there have been attempts to do this kind of spatial averaging of turbulence in the canopy, for example, the CSIRO Morga Forest experiment by Michael Ropak, Yves Brunet, and me in the late 90s tried to do that, but our sonic anemometers were so unreliable, we spent most of our time climbing up and down trees fixing them, so we didn't get that much data. We got a bit. So to get this kind of scale and density of data that's needed, we often resorted to the wind tunnel. This is an aeroelastic canopy in the CSIRO wind tunnel quite a long time ago now. The much more recent thing, the so-called tombstone canopy, made of metal strips, and measured with the laser Doppler anemometer, 3D laser thing. And of course, you can get good repeatable measurements in a wind tunnel, valuable instruments. You do try and do this outside, and of course, and having set everything up, the wind will blow all through the experiment from the wrong direction. So a nice way to avoid the vagaries of fieldwork. But even with that, trying to get the kind of detailed measurements we really need is very difficult. So at the same time as these experiments were going on over a period of 20 or 30 years, the development of large eddy simulations of canopy floors proceeded as well. So this is a simulation, again, of a floor over a 20-meter high forest canopy. The top panel is vertical velocity, and the bottom is scale of fluctuations, so temperature, in fact. And it's interesting to look at this bottom one, because what you see are these clear structures which look like kind of sharp changes in the contours of temperature. And that reflected some measurements which had already been made in real plant canopies, and gave a clue to what was to interpreting data which we'd already found. So if I go on to the next picture. So one of the foci of micrometeorology in the 1980s was the detailed nature of assimilation and evapotranspiration in canopies. And as we've said before, forest canopies are interesting in their own right as carbon stores and sinks, but they also allow that early bulky instrumentation to resolve the canopy wind structure reasonably well. So this was an experiment as part of the Boreas experiment, a large-scale study of the boreal forest. This was running from 1984, and it's an experiment run by my, again, old colleague Roger Shaw from UC Davis. And out of that came these two iconic plots. The first one I'm showing you now, where by measuring the time trace of temperature at different levels through the canopy, it was clear that the temperature trace exhibited this characteristic structure of warming, then sudden cooling, warming, then sudden cooling, usually called temperature ramps. At night, it goes the other way around. So it cools and then warms. But so the question was, well, what's actually going on here? If we go to the next slide, if you stack lots and lots of these time traces on top of one another, lining up the ramp structures, what we find is that the ramps correspond to temperature microfronts. There's a slower warming than the sudden cooling. But if you look also at the same time as at the velocity field, in front of the sudden cooling is upward movement of warm air from within the canopy, the sharp temperature microfront, followed by downward movement of cooler air from above. So what was happening is that the temperature field or the air within the canopy was warming steadily. Then a very large scale gust would come in from above the canopy and displace that and form this sharp change in the temperature field, the kind of thing we were already saw in those large eddy simulations. So in order to sort of understand what was going on here, we actually did a lot of work by trying to understand these structures as linear eigenmodes. Now, I did have a slide on this, but it seems to have disappeared. It's one of the paradoxes of turbulence theory that we have some linear theories which do very well at explaining turbulence, which is a quintessentially nonlinear phenomenon. So rapid distortion theory and hydrodynamic stability theory seems to describe turbulence rather well in some ways. And the reason for this is that the energy containing eddies in the turbulence get their energy directly from the mean fields and the boundary conditions on the turbulence. So the eddies which are best at taking energy from the mean field are the ones which share the symmetries of the mean field. And then those eddies will interact with each other non-linearly, and the energy cascades all the way down through the energy cascade and eventually is dissipated as heat. So there's a series of shear instabilities that produce these coherent canopy eddies corresponding with what we now call an ejection followed by a sweep. And the insight was that the velocity profile at the top of a plant canopy inevitably has an inflection point, this kind of S shape. And an inflected velocity profile is hydrodynamically unstable. As you know, if you have a boundary layer profile and it's inviscid, then it never becomes turbulent. A boundary layer profile is only generates turbulence if you add some viscosity, so that the inertial and the pressure terms get out of phase. But if you have an inflection point like this will spontaneously become turbulent or generate an instability even without viscosity. So this extra process added to the normal turbulent process might offer the clue as to why these large coherent eddies might develop at the top of a plant canopy, the ones we were observing. And we can identify a cascade of instabilities, a linear Kelvin-Helmholtz instability, where you get a vorticity wave. Those waves of vorticity, where the air is trying to roll one way, then the other, it's itself unstable, and they will roll up into what are called Stewart vortices, a train of transverse vortices. Well, they are unstable too, because any small kink in these vortices will differentially affect the vortex in front and the vortex behind in such a way that they'll wrap around each other in a helical pattern. This helical pattern then gets strained in the shear at the top of the canopy and produces these head down and head up hairpin vortices, which actually get glued together by self-induction, the kind of process that makes smoke rings coherent. So then finally, between the legs of the head up hairpin, which leads, you get an ejection, and between the legs of the head down hairpin, which follows, you get a sweep. And between the two, you get a pressure pulse, and you get this scale and microfront. And the key parameter which controls this instability is the vorticity thickness. The velocity at the top of the canopy divided by the shear at the top of the canopy. And we actually did some measurements of this over a whole series of canopies, calculated from the shape of the inflection point, and compared that with the spacing of the vortices over a range of canopies from 5 centimeter wind tunnel models to 20 odd meter forest canopies, and we got this quite remarkable correspondence, which suggested that this was actually the origin of these things. And we also then did some large eddy simulations and tried to pull out of the large eddy simulations the signal of these coherent vortices. What we're plotting here is a quantity called lambda 2. These are regions with a negative second eigenvalue of the sum of the squares of the symmetric and antisymmetric parts of the velocity gradient tensor. It's a bit of a mouthful. So lambda 2 actually picks out regions with both high vorticity and coherent rotation. So you can see the head down hairpin following the head up hairpin, the scalar microfront in between, and located between the legs of the hairpins is a peak in UW, in this case a sweep, positive U and negative W, in this case an ejection, negative U prime and positive W prime. So that seemed like we were onto something, particularly as you move farther up above the canopy into the bottom of the inertial sublayer, the log layer, and you find that nice coherent picture disappears. And we get mainly head up kind of, or ejections, and hardly any or much weaker sweeps. And this whole clear picture has become very ragged. If we take a slice through that, we can see this characteristic pattern. And in this case, this is slightly different, because now what we've done is take a field from the large eddy simulation when the overall stability of this 5 kilometer by 5 kilometer patch is quite unstable, strongly unstable, Z upon L, the average Oberkopf length of the whole 5K by 5K region. But we've pulled out of this times when the local stability in a much smaller patch, smaller region, is low. In other words, when there's a region of strong shear. And in those regions, even though the overall stability of the region, of the domain, if you like, the very large domain, is strongly unstable, in patches around that domain, patches on the surface, there are regions where things are quite near neutral. And in those regions, we see the characteristic ejection, sweep, scalar microfront pattern. So with this kind of knowledge of what we thought was the reason, the controlling parameter of these, what we call mixing layer eddies, because that inflection point instability is characteristic of mixing layers in engineering flows, where you have a fast moving flow and a slow moving flow divided by a plate, and then you allow them to mix downwind of the plate. You get this inflection point in the velocity profile, and you get large coherent eddies. So what we did then was to say, okay, we have a parameter, the vorticity thickness. Remember, it's the velocity at the top of the canopy divided by the velocity gradient at the top of the canopy. We've got an extra parameter now to redo that dimensionless analysis that led to the Monod-Oberkopf theory. We've now got another dimensionless group we can form, as well as Z upon L, the Oberkopf length. We can get Z upon the vorticity thickness. And note that we've changed the origin of Z to the displacement height, the height at which the average height at which the momentum in the canopy is absorbed by the trees in the canopy. And so with a bit of dimensionless analysis and similarity theory, we can deduce the form of the 5 functions which affect the gradients, and the integrated form of the 5 functions which affect the actual velocity field. And what we have then is a modification of the Monod-Oberkopf theory above the canopy. And this time, instead of looking at different stabilities, we're looking at canopies of different densities. So this is the Morga Forest in between Canberra and the coast. And we have got the leaf area index of that is about 2. The Tumbarumba Forest I showed you before, the leaf area index is about 3. And Duke Forest in North Carolina with the leaf area index of getting on for 4. And in each of those cases, this modification works very well to modify MOSC. And more recently, Gordon Bonin at NCAR and this paper from Finnigan has looked at applying this theory across a very wide range of canopies, and it seems to work remarkably well in many, many cases. So I'm going to have to move on quickly because time's getting on. But if we now go instead to that same simulation, we'll go to regions where the shear is low, across that 5 kilometre by 5 kilometre patch. And if you look at the low shear regions, that characteristic mixing layer eddy structure has disappeared. And instead we get this kind of mess. So what's going on there? Well, it turns out when we look at that more closely, in these regions of low shear, strong instability and locally, what we see are canopy plumes, these coherent plumes of warm air, which these are composites again, which are pretty much the same scale, whether they're in a weakly unstable domain or a free convection domain, same scale and the same lateral and vertical dimensions, also whether they're between below a downdraft in the large scale structures or below an updraft. So these seem to have some coherence and some tendency to have the same structure no matter what else is going on. So again, this was a clue that, well, it might be worth then looking for what linear eigenmodes correspond to these kind of structures. So looking at the actual physical situation, it suggested that what we've got is in the canopy, we have a temperature profile which decreases with height. So it's an unstable profile. The canopy is absorbing radiation, so we have a heat source in the canopy, and the temperature drops as we rise. So we have an unstable situation with warm below and cool above. So that's a bit like a Rayleigh-Benard convection situation where we have a hot plate and a cold plate separated by some distance d, the fluid in between, a linear temperature profile. And as we increase that temperature difference, eventually molecular diffusion can't keep up with the trying to dissipate the temperature difference. And so we start to see these large Rayleigh-Benard convection cells. Now, we have to modify that situation because now we don't have an upper lid. We just have a free upper surface. And we also have a region where, as well as the temperature driving, affecting the flow, we also have drag from the canopy and heat transfer from the foliage. So the classic Rayleigh-Benard signal or parameter that tells you whether things are going to be unstable or just molecular diffusion is the Rayleigh number. And the Rayleigh number is a measure of the balance between the buoyant forces. Let's imagine you had a parcel of warm air, for some reason, some anomaly in the temperature field, and that warm air wants to rise. It's more buoyant than its surroundings. But at the same time, the molecular diffusivity or turbulent diffusivity is trying to destroy the difference between that warm patch and its surroundings. And also at the same time, momentum diffusivity or viscosity is trying to slow down or destroy the difference between the velocity of that parcel moving up and its surroundings, which aren't moving. And in the case of here, we also have to include the drag of the canopy because that has to be put in as well. So we can produce a modified Rayleigh number and test whether we actually observe what this linear eigenmode linear theory suggests is happening. First of all, we can look at the results of the linear theory, which gives us a scale of the structures which might emerge. These are the fastest growing eigenmodes, and they are roughly the same size as the eddy structures that we're seeing, both in the horizontal and the vertical. And the critical Rayleigh number, according to this, the calculations, is exceeded in the free air just above the canopy. If you're going within the canopy, it's not quite, the drag of the canopy is enough to quench the motion. But if you get just above the canopy, then where there's no canopy drag, no foliage drag, then the flow would apparently go unstable. And so we simulated that. So these are animations of the canopy plumes, simulations. You can see that the plumes initiate just above the canopy and then penetrate down into them, as just as the linear theory predicts. So we now have, just as we did before, when we used the knowledge that the vorticity thickness was the controlling instability, the controlling parameter of the mixing layer eddies, we can use the controlling parameter of the thermal plumes, which is the absorption length or the e-folding distance of radiation absorption in the canopy, as an extra parameter. And just as we, in the case of the mixing layer eddies, we could define a phi function. This is the Money-Nabokov phi function, and this is the roughness sublayer phi function. Has that particular form. In this case of the canopy plume eddies, this phi is a function now of the absorption distance of the radiation into the canopy. So we can then modify, we can modify our corrections to the Money-Nabokov theory. So, okay, just got enough time to finish this up then. So this is a story so far, if I can go through it. The large-scale eddies that span the atmospheric boundary layer are linear eigenmodes of the shear and buoyancy fields of the ABL, and they change the structure from rolls to cells as this overall stability parameter, the ordering parameter, minus Z upon L, where Z is Zi, the whole thickness of the boundary layer, and L is the average L of the whole domain that you're looking at. And they partition the canopy locally into regions of high and low instability. When there's strong shear, there's low instability. When there's low shear, there's high instability, given that the sun's still shining. So in the regions where the shear is high and instability low, we get these coherent mixing layer eddies, which are related to the inflection point at the top of the canopy, and the controlling length scales of vorticity thickness. And we can form a dimensionless group that can be combined with the Money-Nabokov's Z over the Money-Nabokov length to modify Money-Nabokov theory when instability isn't too high. But when shear is low and instability high, these buoyant plume eddies dominate, and these are eigenmodes of a different kind of instability, and the controlling length scale is this. Now, an interesting point is that both of these instabilities are instabilities of the wind and temperature field, so they're effectively mutually exclusive. There's a little bit of overlap, because if you get buoyant plumes and you start to crank up the shear, you start to, first of all, bend over the plumes, and then you get a transition. Or if you have mixing layer eddies, and then you start to increase the buoyancy, you eventually destroy the shear that the mixing layer eddies are depending on. So there's kind of a blurry region in between, but basically the transition between the two is quite sharp. So the fourth piece of the puzzle is, how are these things coupled? The large scale eddies that modulate the surface, the two different kind of eddies that appear in the surface, and how they affect in turn the large scale eddies that affect them. So we can look at probability distribution functions of Richardson number caused by the footprints of these large scale eddies as the domain level stability changes. And most of the probability for strong shear is in these near neutral domains. And as we make the whole domain by reducing the geostrophic wind, make the whole domain more and more unstable, then we get more and more regions of strong instability. That's clearer to see if we look at the probability distribution functions on a log scale. So we can see that in the near neutral case, where Zi upon the average upper cuff length is nearly 0, all the way up to free convection. And if we do look then at phi m and phi h to -1, remember these are the parameters from the Molnikovnikov theory, which modulate the diffusivities of heat and momentum. They depend, it turns out, on the local Richardson number, not on the domain level Richardson number. So we can see the overlap as we go from strongly unstable, then we start to overlap with moderately unstable. So in this region, there are patches of both smaller patches where probably about between 10 and 50 canopy heights, which are enough for one or the other instabilities to develop, and then all the way down to the near neutral case where most of the stuff is strongly sheared and near neutral. So we have this variation that independent of what the large scale features of the region are, large scale stabilities, locally there's a variation between patches of strong instability and patches of low instability, and concomitant variation in the diffusivities. And that produces an interesting new conundrum for us, a new closure problem. So I might go through this twice because it's quite an interesting picture. So let's imagine we started off, we could have either a region with a large geostrophic wind, so the region as a whole would seem to have low instability, near neutral, and then we get convective rolls and streamwise large scale rolls and large transfer momentum at the downdrafts. Or the other extreme, as we move through this probability distribution, if you like, by changing the geostrophic wind, we'll have regions where things are dominated by Rayleigh Benard convection cells at the whole boundary layer scale, and smaller patches of strong shear, but larger patches of instability. So depending on whether you're in this region or this region, you get one or the other probability distribution patches. If you're in a region where most of the patches have strong shear, low instability, we're going to get mixing layer eddies. If you're in a region where most of the patches have low shear, strong instability, we're going to get canopy plumes with a relatively sharp transition around LC upon L. LC is the canopy momentum absorption length. It's 1 divided by the leaf area per unit volume times the drag coefficient of the canopy. It's the sort of e-folding distance of momentum absorption of a gust in the canopy. So we have a sharp transition between these, but the mix and layer eddies have a turbulent Prandtl number of around 0.8. So they're quite good at transferring momentum. They transfer momentum 80% as well as they transfer heat, but the canopy plumes are much better at transferring heat. So the momentum transferability of the plumes is only 40% of their ability to transfer heat. So the area with mixing layer eddies, which is determined by these probability distributions, plus the area with canopy plumes, so we have to weight the areas by one or the other, determine the average upper cuff length. Remember, the upper cuff length is the ratio of whether you, if you like, the effectiveness of absorbing momentum versus the effectiveness of transferring heat. So that average upper cuff length is a result of the area fractions, but the upper cuff length then combined with the boundary layer height determines whether you're going to get 10 towards rolls or 10 towards cells. And depending on where you are on that will determine how many of these you have or what area of these you have compared to what area of those you have. And that area plus that will determine that. So you have, in effect, a new closure problem because you've got three things going on. And to lock this down, you need to add some more information. And so the question is, where does that information come from? So pretty close to the end here. So the implications of all this for modeling. We really want to change the form of the roughness sublayer influence functions that modify MOS, the 5 functions, to reflect the change in the eddy form with stability, but also the change in atmospheric boundary layer scale eddy structure. And that depends on the average momentum and buoyancy fluxes from the surface, as well as on ZI through that ordering parameter. But we have this new closure problem because the area of mixing layer eddies times the Oberkopf length of the mixing layer eddies, plus the area of canopy plumes times the Oberkopf length of the canopy plumes determines the average. But Zi upon L determines the area fractions. So we need another piece of information. And this really is the subject of a different seminar or another seminar. We can provide this information if we can assume that the atmospheric boundary as a whole self-organizes to maximize the dissipation of energy or the production of entropy. And this is shown to be the case in the free convective ABL. This is a paper by Ozawa et al. In 2016, but it hasn't been done for an atmospheric boundary with both convection and the geostrophic wind. So this is actually the so-called maximum entropy production principle, which is one of the basic, if you like, principles of modern non-equilibrium thermodynamics. As I said, that might be the subject of a different seminar. This is, if you like, stuff we're working on now. In terms of measurement, the eddy flux measurement of surface exchange are subject to unavoidable influences from these ABL scale motions. So for example, the very large scale motions produce horizontal fluxes near the ground, and those horizontal fluxes are coupled to the canopy by small scale eddies, either mixing layer eddies or the canopy plumes. And then as the air moves along above the surface, moves horizontally, it warms, and that warming isn't registered by eddy flux towers, because you can only measure vertical fluxes, until they converge in the canopy plumes. And so we miss that large-scale contribution to the eddy flux, which is why it's almost impossible to close the energy budget on a flux tower without accounting for these ABL scale motions and their interactions. And finally, the interpretation of all this, we see in any paper you like to pick up smooth variation of properties like the Oberkopf phi m and phi h functions and the turbulent Prandtl numbers with stability. But that reflects, you can see now, both the smooth change in the area fractions covered by the two kinds of eddies, as well as a transformation of eddy form. As I said, the transition between the two eddy types is relatively abrupt. So the smooth variation is primarily caused by the smooth variation in area fraction. And I think I better finish there because I've run out of time. I'll put that up as a last thing because that's where this kind of work goes next. There's all sorts of things going on in the atmospheric boundary layer, particularly that affect flux measurements. And in order to deal with that as a whole, we actually have to treat it as a complex adaptive system and regard canopy or biosphere-atmosphere exchange as an emergent property of that system. But treating it like that allows us to bring in these new results from non-equilibrium thermodynamics. But as I said, subject of a seminar for the future. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you so much for the great talk, John. From the audience, if anyone has questions, please feel free to just speak up or either type in the chat. While we wait for that, I may ask a question. I guess more a clarification if I understood it correctly. So if we have a canopy that has low area index and is very sparse, can we then say because the drag of the canopy is smaller, then it's mainly the plume eddies that will be formed compared to mixing layer eddies? And is this true even if we have a near neutral boundary layer? Or probably not? It's more about when we have the thermal effects dominant that this happens.
Yeah, I didn't put enough caveats around this. I'm talking primarily here of relatively dense canopies, not leaf area index of about down to about 2. If you get much sparser canopies, then yeah, you have to modify all this to have the ground surface effect as well. And Gabby Cottell's written a series of papers on this with Daniel Poperato and some others. If you skim through Gabby's publications of the last 10 years, yeah, I think there's one trying to keep track now. I think Cattell, Carver, and Finnigan might be one of them, looking at basically the modifications to some of this basic theory when you have basically when the wind can feel the effect of the ground and most of the momentum is not absorbed. Again, for the canopy plumes, the e-folding distance of radiation absorption is the key parameter if the radiation isn't hitting the ground. If it gets down to the ground, then you've got to modify that, of course. And then it becomes it's interesting. Then it becomes a much more complicated solution of the modified Rayleigh-Benard convection problem, and a bit like the mixing layer eddy solution. It is surprising how sparse the canopy can get before that stops working, at least reasonably approximately.
Thanks. Thanks for having a look into those. We have a question from Min.
Okay, this is Min Chong. Can you hear me?
Yes, thanks.
Because I'm at
I think
home.
I've got your thumb in front of the camera, though.
Do you? I'm not sure what I'm doing. But I'm using an iPad at home.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
So
go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not on my computer. I'm not at work. That's all. Anyway, if you can hear me, I can ask a question.
Yeah,
basically, if you have temperature variation, then you must have viscosity variation with temperature. It's a very interesting talk. I'm interested in boundary layers, but nothing about the talk is way over my head, and I don't understand anything about Obuchov length scale and stuff like that. So, if viscosity is changing, do you account for changes in viscosity, or do you assume the viscosity is constant in your atmospheric boundary layer with the canopy?
We more or less ignore changes in viscosity because the transfer is dominated by the turbulence, not by it's very high Reynolds number, very high Peclet number falls. The only place where you have to start taking account of changes in viscosity, and again, it's not entirely viscosity, is when you look at the source sink strengths of exchange from the leaves. And in the case of momentum, most of the momentum is transferred to leaves by pressure forces, not by viscous forces. But in heat, carbon dioxide, and water vapor transport, then the transfer from the leaf is dominated by molecular diffusivity at the leaf surface. So in those cases, when you then have to parameterize the source strength of from the canopy elements, then you do indeed have to take account of the canopy temperature, the leaf surface temperature.
That would be extremely complicated.
It is. So you try. I've got colleagues downstairs like Graham Farquhar who do this stuff for a living, if you like. But yes, that large eddy simulation I kept referring to actually has a completely parameterized canopy in there. It's a parameterization used in the NCAR community land model, Gordon Bonan's model, which we're now using and putting some of this theory into that model. Yeah, so that does that kind of stuff in great detail. It becomes even more important when you get from movement from through the leaf boundary layer, which is important for heat. But if you're looking at carbon dioxide and water vapor, then you have to look at the movement through the stomata. And then that again becomes even more complicated because the diffusive, the stomatal conductance or stomatal resistance to carbon dioxide transfer, the leaves assimilating carbon dioxide, also depends on the energy of the water molecules which are going in the other direction, which is a temperature dependent thing. So it's yeah, so that's a complex thing that I'll leave to my biological colleagues. Like Ji Lang, who I see is still on the.
Well, if no one is going to ask any question, can I ask one other stupid question?
Oh, please, yeah.
You know, when you say Z on L equals 0, all right, are you assuming Z, which is the wall distance, I guess, is 0, or
No.
if L, the Orbikov length scale, is infinity?
Yes, the latter.
So you're assuming L, this was very large L.
Yes.
So when Z equals 0, I presume that's where the ground is.
Oh, yeah. Well, again, if you're working above the canopy, you have to be a bit careful because as far as the air moving above the canopy is concerned, the effective ground is at the level at which the momentum is absorbed in the canopy on average, which is called the displacement height. So you saw quite a lot of those formula had instead of Z, it had Z minus
Okay.
B. So it's actually moved the origin of coordinates up to the middle of the canopy, often about 70% of the canopy height.
So it's not at Z equals 0.
Sorry?
Because I'm a boundary layer and wind tunnel person,
Yeah.
if I look in my boundary layer wind tunnel, assuming a smooth wall, I assume Z equals 0 is when Z equals 0.
If you had a rough wall, then you'd have to actually move. Well, you don't have to, but you generally move the boundary, move the origin somewhere, maybe to Z0 or somewhere between the top of the roughness elements and the real surface. I mean,
well, anyway, I tried to avoid roughness.
Well,
thank you. And thank you for answering my questions.
All the fun starts with roughness, I'm afraid.
Well, that's what everybody is doing these days, although I've spent years working on boundary layers, but I've tried to avoid roughness.
Well, in some ways, it's interesting because for quite a long time, we've assumed that once you're above the buffer layer, it's like being above the roughness sublayer above a canopy, and above that, the turbulence is the same, whether you're on a rough wall or a canopy or a smooth wall. But this kind of work and other stuff, which I haven't quoted, is beginning to show that that's not actually true. That there are more fundamental differences between the log layer and the smooth wall and the rough wall boundary layer.
Well, thanks for your answers anyway. I worked with Tony Perry for many years, all right? Yeah. And but the thing is, he is an expert in roughness, all right? Yeah. And when I asked him years ago when I was his postdoc, if I should do roughness, he says, "Do you want to give up your career?" So anyway, I have worked with roughness. I have worked with roughness, but I've tried to avoid it. Anyway, this is a huge group at Melbourne working in roughness. I'll leave it to them. I'm retired.
Well, yeah. Well, Ivan has taken over.
Yeah, he's doing really well. So, and I'm a retired old fuddy-duddy professor, so why bother? Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
I may use the opportunity to ask one more question about myself. How would you describe the impact of the movement of trees? So because of the wind, and how important is that on all of what you described?
There's it's usually not considered, basically because when you do things like deduce the the canopy drag coefficient, or we tend to use the LC instead, the canopy penetration distance. Any movement of the foliage is sort of included in that. I was quite hung up on this for a long time, and there's a paper I wrote a long time ago, 1984, I think, in a book called The Forest Atmosphere Interaction. It's the report of a conference at Oak Ridge, Tennessee in 1983, where a lot of this early canopy understanding stuff was first spelled out by people like Tom Denby, Frank Bradley, Dennis Baldocchi, Roger Shaw, and a bunch of colleagues like that. And in that paper, I can send you a copy if you're interested. I actually did analyze in detail how to deal with canopy movements. In fact, the paper was called, in fact, my PhD was called Earth Flowing Waving Plant Canopies. So if you go so trees sort of do the thing, and it's when they get to coherent waving that interesting things can happen. So as you probably know, you get Honami in crop plants, and if you have a very flexible canopy like grass, you'll see the waves through the grass, but that's a kind of a passive reaction to the eddy structure. If you have a canopy which has its own elasticity, so like wheat, which wants to wave at a certain frequency, then you get an interesting phenomenon where if the waving of the canopy, the frequency of the stalks waving, coincides with the frequency at which the eddies from the large eddies from the floor above arise, then the two can get into a kind of a resonance. And in fact, well, it's a bit speculative, but I did theorize that the pressure field that you get from the waving can actually lock in the frequency of the sweep ejection train. There is a possibility for that ejection, and there are a couple of papers written on this by some French colleagues. Again, I can send you this if you're interested. Because I reviewed it in a short piece for Journal of Fluid Mechanics a few years ago. If you go to forest canopies, then when you get coherent waving, it's usually not particularly coherent, but particularly in pine plantations, it can happen. And then this can be associated with wind throw, wind damage.
Yeah.
And interestingly, you get away from pure micrometeorology, but if you have very wet soils of a certain kind with a high clay content, when the trees start to wave in strong winds, then that rhythmic stress on the soil actually changes the character of the soil, and it becomes a kind of a fluid, and the trees fall over. So it's called quick clay. Then it happens in certain in soils with certain clay content. Anyway, that's getting off the topic a bit. But...
Very interesting. Yeah, no, very interesting. So can I conclude that if we don't have actually strong waving, basically that impact is very small?
Well, I'm not sure I don't know if we've actually got the measurements that say that that it's small. It's just that we don't actually calculate the net result in any way that's related to measurements of the waving itself.
Yeah.
If you send me an email, and I'll try and send you those papers.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That's great. Thank you. Do we have any other questions? I guess not. And then I guess we thank you for your time today, for the great presentation, and thanks everyone for joining. And we can end the session today. Thank you.
Thanks, Susanna. Thank you very much.
Thank you.